Hi, this is Peter Linneman. It's the afternoon of April 9. Thought I would share a few thoughts again just to help you hopefully think things through. And also it helps me get my own thoughts together and make a little more sanity on what I'm doing. So I'm happy to share. We will continue to post on Linneman Associates various tweets or thoughts or reactions. And probably I'll do this for another couple of weeks. Once a week, we'll post there. Hope you find them helpful. You can also reach out to my brother Doug Linneman at dlinneman@linnemanassociates.com. If you would like information about anything we do, including Linneman letter or advisory services or whatever it might be. We hope that you're safe and we hope that you're surviving this very difficult time. I might say, unfortunately, this has been one of the most accurate predictions I've ever made in my career, in that a month ago, I did a session where I indicated that we're about to have the worst economic situation in the United States modern history. It'll be worse than the financial crisis. It'll be worse than 1981, 1982, because when you shut an economy down, you can't be surprised that it becomes a disaster. And in an odd way, imagine if some situation occurred where something like ISIS took over our country. And I don't mean this in the Muslim sense. I mean it in the radical decision-making sense. If they took over the economy and they shut down all the stores and they shut down the movie theaters and they shut down the entertainment centers and they shut down any business that wasn't doing exactly what they wanted the business to do, how long would it take for that economy to crash? And all of you would say, well, it would crash instantly. That's what's happened in the U.S., is that we have shut down, it's hard to know the exact number, but somewhere between 30 and 40% of the economy shut down. And now what we're seeing is the effects of that 30 to 40% of the economy being shut down is not only they go from high production to zero, but as they go to zero, the knock-on effects in other sectors start setting in. And you're even seeing that governments, state governments, local governments, are realizing that they have massive declines in their income from taxes that are occurring during the shutdown. And while in first instance their employees are protected, they're not going to be protected if you've got 30 to 40% of the economy shut down and the tax proceeds from that sector comes. So suddenly even the protected sector of the economy starts melting down. And it will knock on. You're even seeing situations where the Facebooks and Googles and of the world are suffering because, yes, they're doing fine, they're able to operate pretty well, but their advertising revenue is down. And why is their advertising revenue is down? Is because if you lost your job, you're not looking to buy as much online as you once were, or you're not looking to spend as much discretionary money. So the advertisements have died even for strong companies that are not shut down. So this ISIS economy, obviously we don't have the violence. That's the good part. But this mandated shutdown of the economy. And by the way, this is not about Trump, and this is not about the U.S. and Democrats and Republicans. As you know, this has swept almost all the countries of the world. as they've sort of gone into groupthink. They've all sort of done the same thing to variations. Their people have abided by them to differing degrees, but they've all adopted a shutdown policy that was implemented by a highly authoritarian government, which hid the facts initially and then absolutely shut things down in the case of China. And I'm not sure that following authoritarian countries' policy leads is generally a good policy, and yet that's what all the countries have gravitated. And I'll come back to that a little later. So I was right. In a mere month, we went from the strongest economy the U.S. has ever seen, as you ended the first week of March, to the weakest we've seen since the 1930s, 4 weeks later. The number of unemployed has gone from about 5 million at the end of the first week in March to probably about 31 million as we sit here today. Remember, the actual data lags, so we're not going to know that number for some time yet. But by any reasonable estimate, it's probably around 31 million today. That means instead of having 157 million employed, as we did the first week of March, we're now down to probably around 131 million people employed. That is about the same level of employment as the U.S. economy had in the beginning of 1999. And obviously our population has had years of growth. We've had years of productivity growth. And yet we are back to where we were in 1999. And I remind you that 1999 was a strong economic year. So it was a blip up. We've gone from 3.5% unemployment the first week of March to about 19% unemployment as I sit here today. And to give you benchmarks, during the financial crisis in early 2009, it maxed out at 10.3%. And the highest it's been since the 1930s was in 1982, when it briefly hit 10.8%. We are almost double those numbers today. And they are instant numbers. My calculations are that we're losing, every day the shutdown is losing about $20.5 billion. That's about 7 basis points per day of GDP being lost, or about 70 basis points per week. That means that versus a month ago, at the end of the first week of March, GDP has fallen nearly 3%. And year over year, it is probably down some number like 1%. And the only reason it's 1% year over year is between a year ago and the beginning of March, there was about 2% growth that had occurred. Again, to give you a benchmark, during the financial crisis, it fell by about 2.5%. So during the entirety of the financial crisis, it fell by 2.5%, and in 4 weeks, it's fallen by nearly 3%. It not only is rising at the rate of 7 basis points a day, but in fact, it's going to increase from 7 basis points a day upward. And that's because not only are the shutdown parts of the economy losing, but every day that goes by, the non-shutdown parts of the economy suffer those knock-on effects. In 4 more weeks, we will have about 6% lower GDP than the end of the first week of March. And again, year over year, it will be about 4% down because of the intervening growth that occurred between April and the beginning of March. 5.6% will be more, or 6% will be more than 2 times the drop that occurred during the entire financial crisis. And this still continues, because even if we open up, we'll continue to lose GDP, but we'll just lose it at a slower rate. And this is why I say we have this curve we must flatten. This curve is destroying lives, it's destroying livelihoods, it's fraying social fabrics, and it will get staggeringly worse as the class of 2020 graduates in May and June and has no jobs and no source of income and no source of opportunity, and having massive numbers of young people who come out with no jobs and no opportunity is not a formula for a successful society and for successful lives. This is about lives and livelihoods versus lives and livelihood. You can do some algebra, I don't know what else to call it, in that what is it worth in terms of what we're giving up for any lives we might save. So I looked up, and various governmental agencies in their cost-benefit analyses use values of life between 4 million and 9 million per life saved, depending on, are they young, are they old, are they high earners or low earners. And by the way, by most economic analyses, those numbers tend to be high, but nonetheless, they have been used for years by governments in terms of evaluating policies, and about, again, 4 to 9 million, depending on the government agency. Court rulings, when someone dies in a wrongful death and they get compensation for that death, yes, you see staggering numbers come out in the headlines, but if you look at it, the typical court award is somewhere between $1.5 to $2.5 million for a life loss, depending again on how old they are, how healthy they are, what their earning capacity was, their family situation was. And those who say that society can't put a value on life, I would remind you that we have people serving in the military, and when they are killed in action, the program that society has put in place for many years, and you have heard no hue and cry to change it over the years, assigns effectively a value of about $200,000 in future value benefits to the survivor. So I take those numbers as crude estimates of what society has said life is worth in making very hard decisions, such as sending someone into harm's way, or when trying to award someone in a wrongful death, or in trying to balance costs versus benefits of government policy. Since 2013, the U.S. death rate has risen by 0.7 people per thousand. In 6 years, that is not related, by the way, to COVID. That was before this began. So in 6 years, the death rate per thousand went up 0.7 people from its all-time low, by the way. 2008 to 2013 was the all-time low death rate at about 8.1 to 8.2 people per thousand. That increase is associated primarily with drug deaths, suicides, what Angus Deaton refers to as deaths from despair, and also obesity, diabetes, COPD, and other chronic diseases. So in the last 6 years prior to the start of 2020, we were registering around 230,000 more deaths a year due to drugs and suicides and chronic disease. And yet we did not mandate that everybody in the United States must participate under the penalty of law in a rigorous exercise program and in a rigorous diet to save those lives. And we did not ban opioid products because they have good things associated with them as well as abuse and death associated with them. And we decided to leave them on the market. And as you know, we've never banned cigarettes. Yes, we tax it, but we never banned cigarettes. We have decided that death is part of life. I would note, by the way, that when I'm born, and for the first 25 years of my life, the death rate was about 9.5 people per thousand. So I've lived the first 25 years of my life in a world where people assumed it was normal when 9.5 people out of 1,000 died. And in fact, my father died of a heart attack at the age of 49. And yes, people said, well, he was pretty young for his age. But it was what happened in that world. We did, again, not make diet mandatory. We didn't make exercise mandatory. We didn't make him stop smoking as a mandatory policy. We certainly didn't shut down the economy to make sure he didn't die. My guess is that we're going to lose around 35% of GDP, as well as the growth that otherwise would have occurred on top of the lost GDP. Just to clarify, not only are we getting the loss that occurred, but we're not getting the growth that would have occurred on top. So we have a double whammy. And people are finally coming around to about my number that over the next year or so, we're going to lose about 35% of GDP. We've already, as I said, by the end of this month, going to be having lost 6% of GDP. And then it's just a matter of every day it keeps going up. That's $7.6 trillion. $7.6 trillion. If you say we save 500,000 net lives by the shutdown, and what do I mean by a net life? The best estimates I've seen say that about half of the people who are dying as a result of COVID, and they're dying horrible deaths and in very unpleasant manners, and it's not nice, and it's a very awful disease, but about half of them would have died in the next year anyway. So to have net deaths of about 500,000 means we would have had gross deaths of about 1 million. And that is by far the upper end of what you tend to see if the shutdown were greatly loosened and people took their own safety measures on how to protect themselves. If we will save 500,000 net lives and we lose $7.6 trillion, that's $15 million a life. And I remind you again, the government uses $4 to $9 million a life in their estimates. The courts use $1.5 to $2.5 million. And for a soldier, a young person killed in action, we assign 200,000-ish as the value of a life. And even if we're saving 500,000 net lives, that cost is $15 million a life. If we only save 250,000 net lives, that is 500,000 gross deaths, it goes to $30 million a life. That does not even pick up the fact that there will be additional deaths from despair, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, mental illness, There'll be spousal abuse, there'll be child abuse, there'll be all sorts of malbehavior. And ultimately, as this goes on, the risk of social unrest goes up enormously, particularly as the class of 2020 graduates and finds not only no jobs, but no opportunity. By the way, if in fact those deaths were to occur, as I described, the death rate in the United States would rise from about 8.9 people per thousand, which it was in 2019, to about 9.1 or 9.2 per thousand. The interesting thing about that is there are still a lot of deaths. This impact on overall deaths is quite small. We're living with the fact that almost 9 people out of 1,000 are already dying, up from 8.2 people per thousand just 6 years earlier. And in fact, the 9.1 people per thousand is notably below anything that would have been experienced in the first 25 years of my life. That is to say, society is capable of dealing with such deaths. Is there going to be a lot of sorrow and unhappiness and misery? Of course. That is the nature, but death is part of life. I think the recovery out of this, from whenever it opens up, will be slow. It'll take 2 to 3 years, I think, to get back to normal. If they'd have shut down for a week or two, I think we would have recovered in a matter of a month or two. The fact that we will be shut down for 8 weeks, 12 weeks, means that it gets much more frayed. We are not rebooting as we come out of the normal recession. When you come out of the normal recessions, you have hard-hit companies rebooting from 85% of what they were doing, trying to get back up to 100% of what they were doing. But people were at work, the company was functioning, the industry was functioning, and yes, not as many people were traveling, not as many people were in Vegas. But even in the depths of the financial crisis, there were a lot of people in Vegas. There were a lot of people in Orlando. There were a lot of people on planes. There were a lot of people at Macy's and other stores. Yes, not as many as before the recession set in, but a lot of people. Now, when you think about what has to happen to reboot from a zero situation, not an 85% situation, but 35% or more of the economy being at a zero, it's the difference between a rolling start and a standing start. It's the difference between a running jump and a standing jump in terms of the difficulty of the exercise. And I'll take a very simple example. Imagine one of those huge casinos and hotel complexes out in Las Vegas, and it's going to be shut for 2 months. All the employees basically have been furloughed. All the food is gone. All the toilet paper is definitely gone, because you know that's been dealt with. Soap is gone. That's been dealt with. All the property is got to be restarted. All the bookings have been canceled. All the advanced bookings have been canceled. Everything has to start from zero. It means that they aren't even going to be open the next day when they're allowed to open, because they have to restock food. They have to rehire employees. They have to restock their toilet paper. That alone is going to make it difficult for them to reopen. And you say, oh, come on, he's joking. Not really. Yes, there are a lot of people that would want jobs, but you have to physically get them there. Yes, you have to advertise, we're open. Yes, you have to get the airlines working to get them in there. So I'm taking what is an extreme example, but getting one of those massive machines, if you will, of a Las Vegas resort casino back up and operating, even once you say you're allowed to operate, will be a very time-consuming exercise. At the opposite extreme, hair salons are going to basically go back to very close to their business of the first week of March. None of us have had haircuts. We're finding out what people's true hair color is as it grows out. The roots become evident. Everything's getting shaggy. And yeah, we'll put on masks and we'll wash our hands and we'll all wear gloves and we'll all go in and everybody. That business will bounce back fastest, and things like the casino will bounce back most slowly. There will be a lot of entrepreneurs who 2 and 3 months was just too long to wait. And yes, the PPP program tried to help them, but a lot of them were already gone by the time that program was implemented. And as I sit here today on the Thursday, I'm not aware of anyone who's gotten their money that was applied for either Friday last week, Monday, Tuesday this week. I'm not blaming the government. I think the government and the banks have been amazingly responsive in this regard. But sometimes the cavalry doesn't get there in time. And so a lot of small businesses are just not going to be there to reopen. There's going to be nobody there to hire the workers back. Eventually there will be, but that frayed infrastructure. So think of the two extremes. Hair salons, almost an immediate bounce back, and at the other end are going to be these very affected products, very complicated products, and something like the big casino where there's a lot of human interaction, a lot of people involved, a lot of product involved will be at the other end. Where are we at in terms of real estate? It appears from the early information for April that shopping centers are collecting somewhere between 30 and 50% of their normal rent collections, and apartments are collecting about 15% below their normal collections for April. My prediction was that it was going to be for apartments about 20% less. Looks like it could be a little better than that. We'll see what it ends up. A lot has to do with those who haven't paid. Are they not going to pay at all, or will they come in late? Office is somewhere in between. Industrial, a bit higher, but not as high as apartments, running in the, it seems like 30 to 40% off of March numbers. In terms of values, industrial properties, at least on Wall Street, have fallen by 15 to 20% in value. Apartments on Wall Street by 25 to 30% in value. Strip centers by 30 to 35%. I would remind you that the ones on Wall Street are among the higher quality strip centers. Malls, and again, they're among the highest quality malls, have fallen in value by 30 to 35%. Hotels, 30 to 35%. Healthcare properties, 30 to 35%. I don't think there is a private market right now. The bid-ask between what a seller would want and a buyer would demand is huge. So all we really have to go on are these Wall Street. What is the value? By the way, that's not what the stock price is down. The stock price is down more than that because the stock price is the equity claim, and the equity claim has fallen more than the value of the enterprise because the debt is being treated, at least in these calculations, as worth par. Do I believe these assets have been oversold? Yes, I think they look cheap. I don't believe that the perpetuity value of a good property, a good apartment building, etc., are down anywhere from 15 to 35%. Due to this, even if this is a difficult recovery, even if it does go very slowly coming out, I just don't think they're worth that. They might be worth 3% less, they might be worth 5% less, but not these type of numbers. However, catching a falling knife is a very difficult thing. It's a wonderful trick when you pull it off. It looks very impressive when a magician catches a falling knife, but you can get seriously hurt. And it just feels to me that for most of us, trying to say this is the right time, it's just too early. These assets could go down much more in value because the drop is not about the fundamental future cash flows. As I say, those could be down 3%, 5% into perpetuity. It is about fear versus greed. It's about what's the discount rate. It's about how risky is this. And we've swung from greed to fear. We've swung from pretty decent greed to absolute fear on these assets. And we don't even have the information on which to convince ourselves whether our fear is right or wrong. Therefore, even though I believe these assets are massively undervalued, I'm being very cautious. I've not bought anything during all this, and I've not sold anything during this. I'm riding it out with a sense of ignorance is bliss. I have a view that they're undervalued, but I want to maintain my cash buffers because I don't know if this could get a lot worse. If civil unrest happened, for example, notable civil unrest, it would get a lot worse before it got better. And that's what I mean by the falling knife. You can envision some horrible scenarios where civil unrest happens and shopping centers and office buildings and so forth start getting destroyed and looted. And I'm hopeful that doesn't happen, but I am worried. The government programs have helped. I am the most anti-government intervention person you could know, generally speaking. But I think these programs are intellectually, not just practically, but intellectually appropriate. And that is because they're not bailouts. These programs, if you think about them, are more in line with your constitutional protection to not have your assets taken by the government without fair compensation. And that's part of the Constitution. And these losses are not reflective of things you did. They're reflective of the government taking away your ability to operate your business, telling you in many cases you cannot operate your business. And I don't want to get into the technicalities of whether that is a legal taking or not. By any common sense approach, this is a taking, an economic taking by the government. And that is where these value losses have come. And therefore, the government stepping up and compensating is absolutely legitimate. And in fact, if you think about it, capping it at 100,000 or whatever is not, because they had their asset taken just as much as a lower income person. So I understand the political realities of that. But don't think of this as bailouts. This is making compensation for economic takings by the government. Unfortunately, by the time these programs are getting there, some of the people are already economically dead. Obviously, the unemployment that they hope to staunch by the PPP program has been way too late for about 26 million people, maybe even more. Not by bad action. It's just that it's sometimes the cavalry gets there too late, even if the cavalry's trying. My biggest concern remains the class of 2020. The class of 2020 does not qualify for unemployment claims because they weren't working. They're going to come out with no jobs and no qualification for any of these programs other than forbearance on their student loans, but they weren't going to pay them anyway because they didn't have any income. So that's a group that is going to be quite stressed. The raising of the unemployment benefits, you could argue, is a very good thing, although it's, again, only just starting this week. So again, there's been a month worth of damage to some number like 26 million people before it got there. It will help. We have to be careful that in the long term, it doesn't keep unemployment high. One of the things research found on the financial crisis is that when they upped unemployment benefits, it was clearly helpful in the short term, but as they kept extending how long you could receive them, there were a lot of people who were choosing to stay on unemployment rather than working because it paid better. And just for fast numbers, you're getting $400 normal unemployment benefit and $600 special. That's $1,000. You're doing pretty well compared to most situations. So it's a good intention, but we have to watch that it doesn't ultimately feed the problem. Consumer confidence off a cliff. The numbers came out today. They were almost exactly where I expected, around 70. I think they could go as low by the end of the month of some number in the 40 to 50 range. How can you be confident if one out of every three people you know is unemployed and has been so for a month or more, and things are getting worse economically by the day? Even if we're getting fewer deaths, if we had no deaths and we had this happening, you would not have high consumer confidence. That means auto and housing and sectors that require confidence, taking vacations, are going to take a while to rebuild, because even if we all go back, confidence is going to lag. Notion of forbearance. Yes, forbearance by lenders, I think, is an important thing. I get the impression that the Federal Reserve is putting a lot of pressure on the major banks to forbear. Freddie and Fannie, as government agencies or GSEs, are showing that they're willing to forbear. And that's a good thing. Again, this is more akin to compensation for a taking than anything else. And for good or for bad, the government has taken to using banks over the last several downturns as a way they implement their policies. So I think it's essential that banks forbear. I think what they really should have done is had a collateral value freeze that said whatever your collateral value was the first week of March, and if you were in compliance with all covenants and you were current as of the first week of March, you have 90 days or 120 days or 60 days after the shutdown ends, some variation like that, where you have interest forbearance guaranteed, you have loan forbearance, there is no sense of default, no action of margin calls could take place, etc. Just freeze the world there would have been good for the economy, rather than this rush for margin calls and the rush for do I get forbearance or not. But I do think there's going to be decent forbearance. There's going to be much better forbearance in this downturn than any other we've seen by lenders. As to landlords, I get the question, well, should we forbear? And we get these requests from our tenants and so forth. And one of the things I say is, and your alternative is, if you don't forbear, what court is going to let you kick them out, given the realities of the situation? Unless they're a criminal, unless they're drug people, yeah, you might then. But what court's going to support your kicking a tenant out for non-payment in this situation? I just can't imagine. You're going to put money into kicking a tenant out who was a good tenant up to that moment until the government took away their livelihood. And you're going to expect the government to back you. And you got nobody to put in that space anyway for at least a year or two in most instances. So in terms of forbearance for landlords out there, try to collect every penny you can get. Try to restructure arrears so that you'll collect them in the future. You spread their arrears with no penalty over a year that has to say by the end of 2021, you've not only gotten current on your rent, you've paid arrears. The reality is, I think this is going to be grim enough that assume you're not going to collect it. Try to collect it. Your accountant's going to make you carry it as an account receivable. But I think from a cash management point of view, assume you will not collect arrearage, even if you have an agreement with a tenant that says they will. Because the tenant's going to basically say, I had no money during those months to pay you with. And I'm having a hard enough time to get my rent to work in a difficult economy. I'm trying to make it work. And now you want me to not only pay my rent in a difficult economy, you want me to make up for months I had no income by government actions? It's going to be very difficult. So my general suggestion is try to collect, forbear, try to get an agreement, and do not assume you'll collect it. Couple of last thoughts. What if we don't find a vaccine or a great treatment for COVID? We never found a vaccine or a great treatment for terrorists. We never found a lot of things. Life is dangerous. This may be one of those moments where the death rate is back up. We learned how to live with higher chronic disease. We've learned how to live with more auto deaths as automobiles got fast back in the day. I think what it is we will adjust, and as we adjust, we'll figure out how to bring the death rates in the future under control. But don't kid yourself. There's no guarantee we get a vaccine. There's no guarantee that we even get a great treatment. Yes, there's something like 40 treatments being experimented with. Yes, there are high hopes, but there's no guarantee. And there's no guarantee of vaccines. There's many diseases we've tried to get vaccines for years, and we don't have vaccines. And there are some diseases we tried for years to get treatment for that we don't have. So I did a back of the envelope calculation, and it says that basically, that if this never went away, and we adjusted to it by, wearing masks more, greater sanitation, et cetera, and we made those kind of adjustments, we'd probably see our long-term GDP growth rate fall by 25 basis points, 20 basis points, part of that being more deaths, and therefore the population growth, and part of it being reduced productivity growth because we're dealing with all the ways of dealing with it rather than putting it in other kinds of productivity. So, we could lose a fair amount of money every year into perpetuity. On the other hand, that's not a staggering economic difference. I conclude by saying I think it's time for the leaders, the political leaders, the governmental leaders of the world to ask a new question. I think they began by turning to their science and medical, immunological people and saying a very simple question: how do we stop this? And they were told the way to stop it was shut down and isolate and shut down and isolate. And in so doing, you reduce the transmission and we flatten the curve, as you've all heard. And that's what we do. And that's a little bit like asking a traffic safety engineer, how do I stop all deaths from autos? Well, that's easy. Don't manufacture any automobiles. Don't let any automobiles be used. You can get rid of all auto deaths by not allowing autos to be used. We can get rid of all terrorist activities related to airplanes by simply saying no one can ever fly. Society has chosen that is too expensive. We've got to ask a different question. And the question we obviously ask about autos is how can we get the number of deaths and harm associated with autos to a livable number? How can we get the level of death and risk associated with air fatalities to a reasonable number? That's a very different question than how do I stop the deaths? Therefore, I think it's time that the leaders have to rephrase the question, and they have to ask it of a broader audience. And the question is, what is the least invasive mechanism we can do that assures, as best we can analyze, that we do not lose more than X net lives a year? And my guess is X is some number in the range of 200,000 to 500,000. I say that in that 200,000 net deaths. Remember, gross deaths would be double that. 200,000 net deaths, 400,000 gross deaths, would raise the deaths in the United States from 2.8 million a year to 3 million a year on a 330 million person population. And that has, to me, the kind of feel. Now, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I cannot believe the answer to that question is complete economic shutdown. Economic shutdown cannot be a good, sustained economic policy. It has never been practiced on a sustained basis in any country that I've been able to find voluntarily. There have been times wars have isolated cities. And if you think about it, the old way you used to siege a city was shut it down, cut it off from everything in the world. And you would starve them, you would deprive them of everything possible. But in terms of imposing on yourself, shutdown cannot be a viable long-term policy. And I could be wrong, but I think it's time for those of us who have the view I have. You've got to be heard in the same way that those who are saying we've got to flatten the curve on the medical side. It has to be made clear what the cost of all this is to lives, to real people, to that we can live with death. We've always lived with death. There's nothing new about death. And I think we just have to have context. I could be wrong in everything I say. I don't know. As I say, I use these to try to get my own head together. I hope it helps you think through for yourself. I'm not asking you to agree with me so much as to consider the things I'm saying informing your thoughts, and I hope they're useful. Again, keep an eye on LinnemanAssociates.com for postings, and we'll put this out again, I think, about this time next week. Anything you want, reach out to D. Linneman at LinnemanAssociates.com. And the last thing I'd say is, and some of you know, I have a education charity in Kenya for orphans and children who are very deprived, and we put them through school and clothing and food. If you think it's difficult here, it is incredibly difficult there. And we are doing our best to make sure that emotionally and life, those children are at least cared for. And I would encourage you to, yes, it is difficult to make your contributions to your chosen charity, but try to not hide in your shell and try to reach out to others and help them, especially those a lot less fortunate. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And with that, I end.